afternoon. Thank you so much for having me. It's actually such a great pleasure to be here at FOSI because I've had such amazing interactions with this community over the last couple of years. In fact, that actually spent a lot of time learning from the people in this room, and it really informed the research that I've been working on. And I'm actually really excited because this is also the first talk since I finished my book, which is has been a long process in the making. And so I have to do the nice thing and be like, buy my book, buy my book. But I actually hope you will actually enjoy the book. And the sort of dirty secret at all is that when it launches, it will be freely available online. So I'd encourage you to read it even if you don't buy it. But today I actually want to sit here and talk to you about one segment of the things that I've been working on for the last couple of years, and that's sort of the issue of privacy. And I want to talk about it because I think that there's often some misunderstandings about how youth really think about and try to achieve privacy, and I want to sort of unpack and interrogate them. And I'm going to do a talk that's sort of a mix for those of you who are familiar with my work. Some of this will be familiar, and hopefully some of it will be totally new. For those who don't know me, I'm an ethnographer. I've spent most of the last decade traveling around the United States, talking to young people about their lives, trying to make sense of it, and trying to map cultural practices. And so what I'm sort of most fascinated by is the moments when young people say things that show a disconnect between youth and adults. And I spend a lot of time trying to do translation work. And my interest in privacy began in 2006 when Bly Loretano Warner put together a youth radio episode where she was in conversation with her mother on the radio episode. And she makes this statement: "It's not like I do anything to be ashamed of, but a girl needs her privacy." And she was talking about her frustration because she had participated in an, at the time, LiveJournal, and she'd put all this material up online, and her mother was constantly accessing it. And she was just frustrated with her mother because she wanted her mother to understand that it was not intended for her. And her mother's response was, well, it's publicly available, so of course it should be read by me. And of course, this was the disconnect. And I started really being fascinated by trying to understand how that took form. And it came in light of a really interesting moment in the mid-2000s where we kept hearing that young people don't care about privacy, because why else would they spend so much time on social media? And I said, this is going to be interesting. So I spent a couple of years really talking to young people about how they understood and envisioned and achieved privacy. And most of what I want to talk to you about today is sort of three core things. The first is that teens actually care a lot about privacy. We saw a lot of that in the data this morning, which was fantastic, especially by the Pew work has been doing tremendous work in this area. But I think it's really important to realize that they actually do care, and we have to understand what it is that they care about. And second, that they're doing really innovative things to actually achieve privacy. I'm going to give some examples of some of the ways in which they go about this. And the third is that adults are actually getting in the way of young people's ability to achieve privacy. And this is sort of where I'm going to get into the more controversial parts in this environment. But I want to sort of begin by saying that just because young people want to participate in public doesn't mean that they want to be public. And it's that distinction that we have to start with to understand why there's such a disconnect. The act of choosing to be in public is a decision to be a part of society. The decision to be public is to display yourself in a way that is performative for everybody across all space and all time. And what's challenging is in the online environment, it's often difficult to be in public without being public. And it's that challenge that young people are often grappling with. And so they're trying to work their way and trying to make sense of privacy in light of their desire to be a part of public life, but not necessarily to make everything that they've ever said go down on their permanent record. Part of it is that the defaults in an online environment have fundamentally changed. In an offline setting, we spend a lot of time having conversations that don't necessarily get recorded. And just because a conversation is happening even in public doesn't mean that it will be spread wildly. In fact, the interactions offline are really private by default, public through effort. It takes effort to publicize an interaction. And it's that process of publicizing what we often think of as the norm. But online, things tend to get inverted. It is often much easier to make things available publicly and then to choose what to constrain. In fact, this is what I see a lot of young people making decisions about what they're doing. They choose what to actually privatize rather than what to publicize. And so a thing like, what you had for breakfast this morning, who cares? Put it up, make it widely accessible. Those who aren't interested won't read it, and we move on. But the thing that might be more problematic or more personal is the thing that you might switch to a different medium. And in fact, we see that all the time, is that medium choice is often very much connected to people's models, especially young people's models of privacy. So texting is a much more private or sort of intimate encounter than necessarily the social network sites or social media. That default is also where things get really tricky because, again, just things, because they're available doesn't mean that they want to have them publicized broadly. Now, teens realize the default is to share, but they expect certain people to recognize that it's not meant to be shared to them, right? And this is where we see a really challenging dynamic around adults. Whether it's teachers, whether it's parents, there's this assumption that adults should understand that this was not meant or intended for them. And of course, this is not necessarily recognized. And this is where we start to see differences and challenges with regard to power, right? That young people are trying to deal with power in their day-to-day lives, in their online environments, and it requires them to negotiate this in social media with the data they're putting out there. Now, part of it is that we have to realize that young people often don't have the power that they may want to actually achieve privacy. They may not have agency, they may not have control, and they're dealing with the challenges of setting boundaries. And here's where I think we need to think about reframing how we talk about privacy. Privacy is not simply the control of the flow of information. Privacy is in many ways the control of a social situation. And that distinction is actually really important because controlling a social situation is actually really, really hard, and I would argue more difficult than simply controlling information flow. In order to control a situation, you actually have to have a level of agency or power in that situation. If your mom is looking over your shoulder, you don't necessarily have control regardless of what interface you have available to you online. So having agency or power within that situation is really important because you have to figure out how to navigate all of the moving pieces. The second really critical thing to controlling a social situation is that you really need to have a deep understanding and knowledge of the context. You need to understand all of the possible actors who might be able to see this, the ways in which they may interpret it, how it may get looked upon around across different time or different space. And that is really difficult when we're thinking about online environments, right? How do you know what the context will be when this is interpreted 10 years from now? We don't. So how do we build out our mental models of what the context is and how do we negotiate accordingly? And the third critical thing is that you need a level of skill to be able to really shape the situation the way you want to, whether it's a matter of technical skills to alter the access control systems, or whether it's a matter of being able to read somebody and have the skills to read them and figure out whether or not they will share something that you didn't want shared. Right? All of this goes into the process of shaping the social situation. And really, that's where we start to see privacy become important, because it's about achieving that control over the situation, regardless of what's available to you. And this is where I start to see young people actually getting really creative about the things that they do. I'm going to give you a couple of examples from my field work just to sort of ground some of this. I'm going to start with a young guy named Hunter, who's actually from the DC region. And I was really interested in his story because Hunter was at an interesting school in town that was really academically focused. But the community that came from, the community that his cousins and his family were a part of, was not particularly academic. And there was often this disconnect between what would happen and the values and views in his home versus that which was playing out in his school. And so this is an example where he gets really frustrated because his sister is always reading things out of context and responding, especially on Facebook, basically provoking his friends in ways that he's really frustrated. And I said to Hunter, like, well, you know, how is she supposed to act? He was frustrated. He's like, she's supposed to know. She's supposed to know what conversations are meant for her and which ones aren't. And he found overwhelmingly that she didn't get it. And so he spent all this time trying to block her from interactions because she didn't respond well. Now, this is him trying to assert social norms over that situation. But this is not necessarily the only way that we see this working, because we often see social norms failing. So Hunter's a really good example of somebody who tried to take Facebook and operate within its structures and try to modify and create groups and separation. And this came up because the thing about Hunter is that he was really interested in what he called old school video games, by which he meant Pokemon and the Legends of Zelda, which made me feel nice and old. But he really loved these old school games, and this was really popular amongst his group of very geeky-minded teens. But his cousins, on the other hand, were really passionate about shooter video games. And he had this problem that would occur because whenever his friends would talk about something related to Zelda or related to Pokemon, his cousins would make fun of his friends. And whenever his cousins were talking about shooter games, his friends would sort of basically provoke his cousins. And it created all of this unnecessary drama. So he spent a lot of time trying to modify the different settings within Facebook in order to separate these two worlds. And this was his way of trying to control a social situation by using the privacy levers that were available to him. Not because he didn't want to have separation, or not because he sort of didn't value both of these communities, but because he wanted separation that made sense within his life. Now, Dealing with collapsed context is one of the biggest challenges that we deal with in an online setting, and it happens overwhelmingly. And this is one of the reasons we're in a really interesting moment with social media, because we're seeing teens fragment across a ton of different apps and a ton of different services, because they find it nearly impossible to try to manage collapsed context in one setting. And so if you come to me on Tumblr, I'm going to act this way. If you come to me on Twitter, I'm going to act this way. If you come to me on Instagram, I'm going to act this way. And we start to see that moving around. Now, of course, there are some much more creative ways of trying to use the technologies to achieve privacy. And I'm going to give you two radically extreme examples that are by no means generalizable, but are really fascinating in an attempt to achieve privacy. The first is a woman named Shamika, who was really frustrated because the past would always come back to haunt her and result in unnecessary drama within her school. And when I prompted her, sort of what constituted the past is anything that happened about a month ago, right? And that was the stuff that would get drawn back into the present. So she did something really interesting. She would log into Facebook, and this was very much a Facebook-driven example, and she would log into Facebook, and she would read the different messages, different comments that are left for her, and then she would delete them. She would go and she would leave comments on other people's pages, and then the next day she would log in and she would delete those. And she basically gave this process of constantly cleansing everything that happened on Facebook so that it only was available if you were there in the short window in which she allowed it. She tried to make it an ephemeral, real-time activity and made this material not persistent. Now, I said to her, I said, well, people could copy and paste this. They could store it. And she's like, yes, but then you'd be violating social norms. Right? And she decided that it was not about the technical ability to record that material, but the social norms by which you could actually bring things back from the past to the present and what was acceptable to be accessible. The other example is from her friend Michaela, who was dealing with a different dynamic here in DC because she was constantly moving between foster families and dealing with state care. And one of the challenges she had is that every time she would go and meet with somebody from the government and from the social services organizations, they would ask her to log into Facebook and all of her other social media accounts to see what she was up to. And she was dealing with a level of surveillance. And for those who haven't dealt with youth in social services, you will find that the kind of surveillance that they experience on a regular basis by the state is extraordinary. And so she was frustrated, and she was frustrated because Facebook was just causing too much trouble, and so she wanted it gone. Now, any of you who have tried to delete Facebook, you know you get to that point when you're going to delete Facebook and it says, you don't really want to do this. You don't have to. Look at all the people that will miss you. These are your friends. They love you. Just deactivate your account. You can always come back at another time. She went, okay. So she deactivated her account. And the next day, she logged in and she reactivated her account. When she was done using it that evening, she deactivated her account. The next day, she logged in, she reactivated her account, she deactivated it. And again and again and again. And she tried to turn Facebook into a real-time activity. And I said to her, well, how does this solve your problem? And she's just like, well, whenever anybody looks from it, within the government, looks for my account information, it comes up as though I don't have an account. So they don't ask me to log in. And I was like, okay. And I said, well, but what if they look at the time when you're on? And she's just like, no, I only log in at night. Adults, they only look at these things during the day, right? And this was her way of really separating her universes. Was it really perfect? No, of course not. But it was a way of working within the system to, again, achieve some semblance of privacy, some control over the social situation that she found herself in. Now, these are really extreme examples, but in fact, there's actually a lot more common examples. And I'm going to tell you the story of Carmen, because Carmen sort of is a beautiful exemplar of this in a delightfully geeky fashion. Carmen is of Argentinian descent, and she could rely on the fact that her mother knew nothing of British cultural references, particularly old-school British cultural references, which is really going to be key to this story. Her mother was really active on Facebook, and she loved that her mother was really active with her on Facebook. But whenever she said anything emotional at all, her mother overreacted, right? And this was just so frustrating, because she was not suicidal just because she posted a song lyric, but her mother often thought so. So one day, she was trying to figure out how to convey to her friends that she and her boyfriend had broken up and she was having a lousy day, and she really wanted different kinds of emotional support. And she did what all teenagers do and try to think of the perfect song lyric to express the emotion. But she couldn't figure out one that wasn't just sort of sappy and depressive, which, note, would trigger mom. And so then she came upon another idea, and she decided to put up a song lyric that she knew that her geeky friends would recognize, but her mother wouldn't. And she put up song lyrics from Always Look on the Bright Side of Life. Now, for those who do not know the Monty Python reference, this is a song sung during the life of Brian when the key character is being crucified. It is not a happy lyric, but the words itself look wonderful, right? And her mom immediately comments on Facebook, it looks like you're having a great day. And and her friends immediately text her, right? Just like knowing what's going on. This level of encoding is the kind of thing that I see on a daily basis with young people. And the way that I like to think of this tactic is as social steganography. Steganography is an old crypto term that means hiding in plain sight. It has a really sordid history that involves Greek slaves, which we will sort of ignore for right now. But it's actually really important because it's a way of making certain that only those in the know where to look. A decade ago when I started this work, very few American youth were using this practice. This was a really dominant practice amongst those engaged in civil disobedience and those who were dealing with repressive regimes. But it has become a normative practice in American culture with youth today, which makes you wonder what exactly going on, civil disobedience, repressive regime, same. And what you start to see is that it's taken on a new life of its own in a variety of different social media contexts. On Twitter, you might hear of subtweeting, which has a drama version to it all, but is a way of encoding content. This is something I often see with Instagram, which is really hysterical, when you think you see a picture of a donut, and you think you understand what's going on, when in fact you have no idea what's happening. And I see this whenever I talk to young people, is that I spend a lot of time looking at their content, and I can no longer make meaning of it. I can no longer interpret what's going on. Because young people have figured out overwhelmingly different ways of making certain that the things that mean the most to them, or ways to actually get messages across to people that they care of through different ways of encoding, whether explicitly or much more subtly. The overuse of pronouns, the references to like, oh my gosh, can you believe what happened on Friday night? Right, is a way of actually referring to a whole set of situations that only those in the know what to look at. All right, so if you think about that kind of practice, and you think about the ways in which young people are trying to achieve privacy, what does this mean when we start to think about adults' relationships to this? One of the things I think is really important to note is that young people have increasingly grown used to or familiar with practices of surveillance. And this was mentioned a little bit earlier on one of the earlier panels, but the ways in which adults have been encouraged to come online and to be present with kids has resulted in most of them figuring out ways to make certain that that parents can not necessarily see what's going on. And what you see is that young people have played a game. Rather than trying to limit the access to content, they're trying to limit the access to meaning. And they do that in light of the fact that they're accustomed to the presence of adults in their lives online. And what is, I think, really striking to me, especially given what we love to think of as the summer of surveillance issues, is that surveillance has become so normalized as a means of protection from scary things in the world that young people are responding to it as part of their daily lives, and we see it sort of play the whole way up. In other words, the same practices that we see as the rhetorics of protecting the American society from security are the same sort of issues that we see in terms of why parents justify surveillance at the home. And herein lies a challenge that I think is important. Surveillance doesn't create safety. It creates the illusion of safety. It creates the appearance that we're doing something, and it doesn't necessarily mean that people have developed the skills or understandings of how to actually deal with these environments. As teens are really trying to seek out privacy, they become more and more savvy at finding ways of avoiding parental gaze when that's important to them. More and more savvy about dealing with surveillance because they see it as a burden to getting what they want to hang out with their friends. So we start to see ways of obscuring. We seek out new apps. We've been playing whack-a-mole, and it's not surprising to me that this is a moment where we're just seeing such a proliferation of tools because it's just this sort of desperation to find some place that you can call your own. And I want to say that privacy is getting more complicated and will continue to get more complicated. Now, while teens are really focused on the people who hold immediate power over them, parents, teachers, law enforcement, college admissions officers, military personnel, there are serious questions that many in this room have about the ways in which surveillance by marketers, corporations, and governments puts youth at risk. But I would argue that if we don't think about how youth are thinking about privacy and the kinds of surveillance that they're experiencing, we can't address these other systemic issues. They're very much intertwined with one another. Now that said, young people, as you've heard already today, young people are far more concerned about their parents than they are the government or corporations. Right? They're not necessarily dealing with that frame, and for that matter, often their parents aren't either. But they're very willing to get creative about ways of dealing with their parents. What would it mean to redirect that creativity to thinking about privacy and surveillance writ large? Now, part of it is that young people are desperate to get access to public space Public space is what they want. They want to be in public. And what's been interesting is that over the last 30 years, we have systematically limited young people's access to public spaces, often under the guise of safety. We've done it to protect them from themselves and to protect them from others. We both fear youth and we're afraid for them. And we go back and forth in these tensions. Safety has become a justification for restriction. But public spaces are really important, and teens need access to them because this is how they make sense of the society around them. They're motivated to engage in social media because they want access to this public. And what it means to be access to public is to understand freedom, to understand liberty. The values that we have as an American society are very much embedded in the ability to get access to public. So the fact that young people are carving out and finding ways to achieve or get access to public and achieve privacy in light of it should be something that should be commended rather than something that is constantly more and more restricted. Now, what I would invite you all to do, as sort of in closing, is to not lock young people out of public life. Helping them achieve privacy isn't about sort of protecting them. Especially teenagers, they need to be given ways of thinking about these issues. Privacy issues are going to become more and more networked. They're about the ways in which we're implicated in each other's lives. And it's about helping young people figure out how to deal with these issues, rather than thinking that you can solve it for them. This is really important, especially if you care about those organizational issues. Now, educating young people to understand boundaries and achieve privacy isn't going to be easy, because it really requires working through these issues holistically, recognizing that that includes privacy from you, privacy from parents, privacy from educators. But part of it is inviting them to actually recognize that that is important, and to encourage them to first seek out privacy from you, and then you'll see them seeking out privacy writ large. We very much need to sort of figure out how to help young people, not just through a message of fear, but through a message of openness, a message of really inviting them to be a part of the solution of the future. And with that in mind, thank you very much. Have a fun conference, and I hope to talk to you soon. Take care.